August 6th, 1945. 8:15 a.m. A single B-29 bomber glides through clear skies over Hiroshima. Below, 350,000 people move through their morning routines, heading to work, opening shops, preparing breakfast. Air raid sirens had sounded earlier, then fell silent. False alarm. Just a weather plane. Then the sky splits open. In 1/1,000,000th of a second, the temperature at ground zero reaches 7,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hotter than the surface of the sun. A flash of light brighter than 1,000 suns blanches the sky white. Buildings evaporate. People vanish mid-step, their shadows burned permanently into stone walls behind them. The mushroom cloud climbs 9 miles into the atmosphere. And 500 miles away in Tokyo, inside the heavily fortified headquarters of the Imperial Japanese Army, War Minister Minister Anami stares at the first scattered reports filtering in from Hiroshima. He doesn't believe a word of it. By August 1945, the Japanese military leadership operated under a specific set of assumptions, rules that had governed warfare for thousands of years. Wars were won through superior strategy, larger armies, and unbreakable will. The atomic bomb shattered every single one of those rules in 43 seconds. But understanding why Japan's military commanders couldn't or wouldn't accept what happened requires understanding who they were. The Supreme Council for the Direction of the War, nicknamed the Big Six, controlled Japan's fate. War Minister Anami, Navy Minister Mitsumasa Yonai, Army Chief of Staff Yoshijiro Umezu, Navy Chief of Staff Suemu Toyoda, Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo, and Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki. These men had spent their entire lives in military service. They'd witnessed the rise of Imperial Japan from a feudal backwater to a Pacific superpower. They'd conquered Manchuria, invaded China, struck Pearl Harbor, and seized territory from the Philippines to Burma. They believed in ketsu-go, the final decisive battle. The plan was simple, brutal, and had worked for centuries of Japanese warfare. Lure the Americans into invading the Japanese homeland, then bleed them so badly in suicidal defensive operations that they'd negotiate a conditional surrender rather than face millions more casualties. Japan had 2.3 million soldiers ready to defend the home islands. Another 28 million civilian militia members trained with bamboo spears and agricultural tools. They'd prepared 10,000 kamikaze aircraft, not just planes, but rockets, boats, and human torpedoes. The entire nation had become a weapon. American casualties, Japanese strategists calculated, could reach 1 million, maybe more. The psychological impact of 10,000 kamikaze attacks, of brutal house-to-house fighting in every city, of mothers and children charging machine gun positions, it would break American resolve. It had to, because the alternative, unconditional surrender, was unthinkable. It meant the end of the emperor's divine status, the dismantling of the military, the transformation of everything Japan had been for 2,000 years. So when the first reports arrived from Hiroshima on August 6th, describing a single bomb that had destroyed an entire city, the military leaders of Japan faced a cognitive impossibility. A weapon like that couldn't exist. War Minister Minister Anami embodied everything the Imperial Japanese Army represented. Born in 1887 in Oita Prefecture to a samurai family, he'd graduated from the Imperial Japanese Army Academy in 1906, served in Siberia, Manchuria, and China. He'd risen through the ranks not through political maneuvering, but through competence, courage, and an absolutely inflexible code of Bushido, the warrior's way. His colleagues called him the Iron General. Anami genuinely believed in the superiority of spirit over material, of will over technology. He'd seen it work. Poorly equipped Japanese soldiers had routed larger, better armed Chinese forces through sheer determination and tactical brilliance. Even against Americans in the Pacific, Japanese forces had inflicted staggering casualties despite being outgunned and outnumbered. But Anami wasn't blind to reality. He knew Japan was losing. Food shortages ravaged the country. American B-29s firebombed cities nightly. The March 9th raid on Tokyo alone killed 100,000 people, more than would die at Hiroshima. Yet firebombing was comprehensible. You could see hundreds of bombers. Count them. Watch the incendiaries fall. Calculate the damage per ton of explosives dropped. The Hiroshima reports described something else entirely. A single plane, one bomb, an entire city erased. The numbers didn't make sense. Conventional explosives couldn't produce that kind of destruction. The blast radius was wrong. The casualty figures were impossible. The descriptions of the flash, the fireball, the strange sickness afflicting survivors afterward, none of it matched any known weapon. Foreign Minister Togo believed it immediately. He'd studied at Western universities, understood theoretical physics, knew that American scientists had been working on atomic fission. When President Truman's statement was broadcast, explicitly calling it an atomic bomb, Togo understood. They'd weaponized the atom. But Anami wasn't a scientist. He was a warrior. And warriors don't surrender because of a single setback. The initial reports from Hiroshima arrived piecemeal, fragmentary, contradictory. The city's entire communication infrastructure had been destroyed. Military headquarters there, silent. Railway stations, obliterated. Telegraph lines, dead. The Supreme Council convened in the underground bunker beneath Tokyo. The room was austere. Concrete walls, a single long table. Maps of the Japanese home islands, marked with defensive positions. Togo pushed for immediate investigation. Anami resisted. One city, Anami said, his voice steady. One attack. America has been firebombing our cities for months. This is propaganda, designed to break our will. But then the reconnaissance photos arrived. Aerial photographs taken by Japanese planes showed Hiroshima's downtown area completely flattened. A perfect circle of destruction, 2 miles in diameter. Buildings that had stood for centuries reduced to shadows and rubble. The Ioi Bridge, the bomb's aiming point, twisted metal. But the outer neighborhoods remained relatively intact. The destruction pattern didn't match saturation bombing. It was too clean, too symmetrical, too impossibly focused. Dr. Yoshio Nishina, Japan's leading nuclear physicist, was dispatched to Hiroshima with a team of scientists. Nishina had studied under Niels Bohr in Copenhagen. He understood atomic theory. He'd even led Japan's own failed attempt to develop an atomic bomb, a program that had foundered due to lack of resources, uranium, and time. When Nishina arrived in Hiroshima on August 7th, his Geiger counters started clicking immediately. The radiation readings were unmistakable. The burn patterns on human skin, the characteristic beta burns from radiation exposure. The destruction of buildings from both blast wave and thermal radiation. The black rain survivors described. Fallout particles returning to Earth. Every indicator confirmed the impossible. America had successfully weaponized nuclear fission. Nishina sent his report to Tokyo. The bomb was definitely atomic. The Supreme Council received the report on August 8th. Anami read it, then set it aside. One bomb, he said. They cannot have many. We continue with ketsu-go. The military logic was sound, from a certain perspective. Even if America possessed atomic bombs, how many could they have? Nuclear fission required enormous amounts of enriched uranium or plutonium. The theoretical literature suggested each bomb needed kilograms of fissile material that took months to produce. Japan's intelligence on the Manhattan Project was fragmentary at best. They knew about the facility at Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and the research site at Los Alamos, New Mexico. But the scale, the industrial capacity, the sheer resources America had poured into the program. Japan's military leadership couldn't conceive of it. If America only had 1 or 2 atomic bombs, then Japan could absorb the losses. Yes, individual cities would be destroyed, but Japan had cities to spare. The Home Island Defense Plan didn't depend on any single urban center. The mathematics were brutal but clear. America would exhaust its atomic arsenal before Japan ran out of cities. And then ketsu-go would proceed as planned. This calculation hinged on a critical assumption. Atomic bombs were rare, difficult to produce, and America couldn't possibly have more than a few. That assumption lasted 3 days. August 9th, 1945. 11:02 a.m., the second sun rises over Nagasaki. The Fat Man plutonium bomb detonates 1,750 feet above the city's Urakami Valley. 22 kilotons of explosive force, more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb. The plutonium implosion design represents even more sophisticated physics, more advanced engineering, more industrial capacity. The flash is visible 250 miles away. In Tokyo, the Supreme Council is in emergency session when the news arrives. Anami is mid-sentence, arguing that Japan must fight on, when an aide enters and hands a message to Prime Minister Suzuki. Suzuki reads it. His face goes gray. "Nagasaki," he says quietly. "Another atomic bomb." The room falls silent. This is the moment. The fulcrum point where military logic collides with physical reality and shatters. 2 atomic bombs, 3 days apart. The implications are devastating. If America can drop 2 atomic bombs in 3 days, they can drop more. Maybe many more. Maybe they have 10, 20, 50. The production capacity exists. The industrial might is real. Japan's strategy of exhausting American resolve through casualties becomes meaningless if America can simply erase Japanese cities from existence, 1 per day, until nothing remains but radioactive ash and the broken remnants of the Emperor's divine empire. Anami stares at the map of Japan on the wall. 70 major cities, hundreds of smaller towns, each one a potential target. But he doesn't surrender. Not yet. "We should verify these reports," Anami says. His voice is calm, controlled. The Iron General showing no emotion. Nagasaki's communications may have been disrupted by conventional bombing. We cannot make decisions based on incomplete intelligence. Foreign Minister Togo explodes. Incomplete intelligence. Minister Anami, the Americans have dropped 2 atomic bombs on our cities in 3 days. How many more cities must burn before you acknowledge reality? "I acknowledge reality," Anami replies, his tone ice cold. "The reality is that if we surrender unconditionally, the Emperor loses his throne. The military is disbanded. Japan ceases to exist as we have known it for thousands of years. These are facts. Whether America has 3 atomic bombs or 300, our duty remains unchanged: to protect the Emperor and preserve the Kokutai, the national essence." Navy Minister Yonai leans forward. "And if protecting the national essence requires sacrificing the entire nation?" The question hangs in the air. Army Chief of Staff Umezu speaks up, siding with Anami. "The Americans may have atomic bombs, but they still need to invade. When their soldiers land on our beaches, when they face 2 million Japanese troops and 28 million civilians willing to die, their bombs won't save them. We can still force a negotiated surrender." Prime Minister Suzuki looks around the table. The council is deadlocked. 3 for surrender, 3 for fighting on. Outside the bunker, Japan burns. Soviet forces have just invaded Manchuria, crushing Japanese armies in a matter of hours. American bombers continue their conventional raids. The naval blockade has reduced food imports to starvation levels. And somewhere in the Pacific, More B-29s are being loaded with atomic bombs. The Americans, unknown to the Japanese leadership, actually have no more bombs ready. But the components for a third are being assembled. Japan doesn't know this, can't know this. The uncertainty itself is a weapon. For 5 days after Nagasaki, Japan's military and civilian leadership argued behind closed doors. The Supreme Council remained deadlocked. Anami and the military chiefs refused to accept unconditional surrender. They wanted conditions: preservation of the emperor system, no occupation of the home islands, Japanese self-disarmament, and the right to conduct their own war crimes trials. The Americans rejected all conditions except one ambiguous acknowledgement that the emperor's status would depend on the freely expressed will of the Japanese people. Still, Anami wouldn't budge. Only when Emperor Hirohito himself intervened, summoning the council on August 10th and again on August 14th, declaring in his own voice that Japan must endure the unendurable and bear the unbearable, did the military finally, reluctantly, accept defeat. Even then, Anami didn't fully believe in the atomic bomb's significance. In his final days, he spoke not of nuclear weapons, but of the Soviet invasion, of the impossibility of fighting a two-front war, of Japan's exhausted resources. The bomb, in his worldview, was just another weapon. Terrible, yes. Unprecedented, certainly. But fundamentally no different than the firebombing of Tokyo, which had killed more people than Hiroshima. What Anami and the military leadership couldn't accept wasn't the atomic bomb's physical destruction. It was what the bomb represented: the absolute obsolescence of their entire worldview. For thousands of years, military power had been about manpower, positioning, will, strategy, courage. The atomic bomb made all of that irrelevant. A single bomber carrying a single bomb could destroy what an army of 1 million men couldn't. Spirit couldn't stop physics. Will couldn't defeat nuclear fission. Bushido was meaningless against gamma radiation. On the night of August 14th, after the Emperor's surrender broadcast had been recorded, Anami sat in his office and wrote a final message. Believing firmly that our sacred land shall never perish, I, with my death, humbly apologize to the Emperor for my great crime. Then he committed seppuku, ritual suicide, according to the ancient samurai tradition. He died as he had lived, by the warrior's code. The atomic age had arrived, but Korochika Anami departed the world still refusing to believe in it. The tragic irony of Anami's disbelief was this: he was partially right. Not about fighting on, that would have been catastrophic, leading to millions more deaths, but about the atomic bomb's limitations. In August 1945, the United States had exactly 2 more atomic bombs in various stages of assembly. The third bomb wouldn't have been ready until late August. The fourth, sometime in September. America's atomic arsenal was nowhere near the infinite supply the Japanese military feared. If Japan had known this, if they'd understood that America's atomic capacity was measured in single digits, not hundreds, would they have surrendered? Probably not immediately. But it would have changed the calculation. Instead of facing the prospect of daily atomic annihilation, they'd have known they could absorb a few more strikes, and then America would be back to conventional warfare. The uncertainty was America's greatest weapon. By not knowing how many bombs existed, Japan had to assume the worst. And the worst-case scenario was civilization ending. But there's a deeper misunderstanding too, one that persists even today. Many historians argue the atomic bombs forced Japan to surrender. The narrative goes, Japan's military leaders were fanatics who would never have surrendered without the existential terror of nuclear annihilation. The reality is more complex. The Soviet invasion of Manchuria on August 9th, the same day as the Nagasaki bombing, was arguably more influential in forcing surrender. Japan's entire strategic position rested on the Soviet Union remaining neutral. If the Soviets stayed out, Japan could focus all resources on the American invasion. If the Soviets stayed out, there was a possibility, however slim, of negotiating a conditional surrender through Soviet mediation. When Stalin declared war and Soviet tanks rolled into Manchuria, that door slammed shut forever. Foreign Minister Togo said explicitly in the surrender debates, "The Soviet entry into the war has sealed our fate." The atomic bombs and the Soviet invasion happened simultaneously. Both were catastrophic. Both shattered Japanese strategic assumptions. Trying to separate which was more important misses the point. It was the combination that broke the deadlock. But the atomic bombs got the headlines. The mushroom clouds became the symbol of Japan's defeat. And in the decades that followed, the mythology solidified. Nuclear weapons ended the war. Period. Full stop. This oversimplification served everyone's interests. America wanted to justify the bomb's use and demonstrate their power to the Soviet Union. Japan wanted to portray themselves as victims of an incomprehensible superweapon rather than defeated by military failure. The Soviet contribution to Japan's defeat was quietly minimized in Western narratives. The truth is messier, more human, more tragic. But here's where it gets really interesting. Was Anami's skepticism about the atomic bomb's war-ending power actually vindicated by history? Consider this. Since 1945, nuclear weapons have been used in war exactly 0 times. Not because they don't work. They work terrifyingly well. But because their destructive power makes them unusable in any rational military strategy. The bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki killed between 150,000 and 250,000 people. Modern nuclear weapons are thousands of times more powerful. A single thermonuclear warhead can destroy an entire metropolitan area. Multiple strikes would cause nuclear winter, potentially ending human civilization. Which means nuclear weapons exist in a strategic paradox. They're the most powerful weapons ever created, yet they're so powerful they can never be used. Anami believed in the primacy of conventional military force. Boots on the ground, ships at sea, planes in the air. In the 80 years since World War II, he's been proven correct. Every war has been fought with conventional weapons. Vietnam, Korea, Iraq, Afghanistan, Ukraine. These conflicts were decided by the same factors that have always decided wars: manpower, logistics, strategy, will, economics. Nuclear weapons lurk in the background, a doomsday threat that prevents total war between major powers but changes nothing about actual combat when it occurs. So in a strange way, Anami's refusal to be impressed by the atomic bomb was prophetic. He understood that war is ultimately about human factors. Technology can be devastating, but it's never the final answer. The mistake wasn't his skepticism about nuclear weapons' lasting impact on warfare. His mistake was not recognizing when Japan had already lost, atomic bombs or not. By August 1945, Japan's military was shattered, its economy in ruins, its people starving. The home islands were blockaded. The oil fields of Southeast Asia were cut off. The empire had contracted to just the Japanese archipelago, and even those islands were under constant bombardment. The atomic bombs didn't create this situation. They simply made it impossible to deny. In the immediate aftermath, though, the world focused entirely on the bombs. Newspapers screamed about the cosmic power unleashed. Scientists became celebrities and targets of fear. The nuclear arms race began before Japan even formally surrendered. President Truman, reflecting on the decision years later, never expressed regret. "The bomb," he said, "simply ended the war." To him, the mathematics were straightforward. 200,000 Japanese dead versus potentially millions of American and Japanese casualties in an invasion. But the mathematics weren't that simple. They never are. Japanese survivors, hibakusha, spent decades advocating for nuclear disarmament. Many were shunned by their own society, considered contaminated by radiation. The psychological trauma extended far beyond the physical injuries. Children born decades later still fear they carry genetic damage from their parents' exposure. The bombs created a moral question that still hasn't been answered. Is it ethical to use weapons that kill indiscriminately? Soldiers, civilians, children, the elderly, all atomized equally? Anami never had to wrestle with that question. His worldview was simpler. Duty to emperor, honor in death, loyalty above all. Whether the weapon was a sword, a bullet, or a nuclear bomb didn't change the fundamental equation. In his final hours, writing his death poem, Anami composed these lines. Having received great favors from His Majesty, I do not have even half a word to say in the hour of my death. He died as he had lived, believing in a code of honor that the modern world, the atomic world, had rendered obsolete, or had it? Here's what makes this story enduringly relevant. The gap between Anami's beliefs and reality is the same gap that exists in military thinking today. Every generation of military leaders faces technologies that seem to make previous warfare obsolete. Tanks replaced cavalry. Aircraft made surface fleets vulnerable. Precision-guided missiles changed ground combat. Drones are changing warfare again. Each time, there's a faction that insists the new technology changes everything. And there's a faction, the animus of the world, who insist that fundamental principles of war remain constant. And both sides are partially right. Technology matters. The atomic bomb did end World War II. Not alone, but as part of a combination of factors that made continued resistance impossible. Modern militaries that ignore technological advancement lose wars. But human factors still matter more. Vietnam defeated American technology through will and strategy. Afghanistan outlasted Soviet and American occupation through patience and commitment. Technology is never sufficient by itself. The lesson of Anami's disbelief isn't that he was stupid or stubborn, though he was certainly stubborn. It's that cognitive biases, especially in military leadership during existential crises, can literally be fatal. When your entire worldview is being challenged. When accepting new information means accepting your life's work was meaningless. When believing the evidence requires abandoning everything you fought for. The human instinct is to reject, deny, reinterpret. Anami looked at the atomic bomb and saw just another weapon. Because accepting it as something categorically different meant accepting that his 40 years of military service, all the campaigns and battles and sacrifices, had become irrelevant overnight. That's not a failure of intelligence. It's a failure of imagination, and a very human one. We're still grappling with the same challenge today. Climate change, artificial intelligence, biotechnology. Each represents a potential paradigm shift as significant as the atomic bomb. And in each case, we see the same pattern. Evidence that challenges existing power structures is rejected, denied, or minimized by those who benefit from the status quo. The question isn't whether we'll face more paradigm-shifting technologies. We will. The question is whether we'll be able to recognize and adapt to them before the consequences become catastrophic. Anami couldn't. He died believing in a world that had already ended. The atomic age didn't just kill 200,000 people in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It killed an entire way of thinking about war, power, and national survival. Some people, like Foreign Minister Togo, like Emperor Hirohito, recognized this immediately. Others, like Anami, never could. And maybe that's the final tragedy. Not that Japan's military leadership couldn't believe in the atomic bomb's power, but that even after seeing the evidence, experiencing the consequences, losing the war, some of them still died, refusing to accept that the world had changed. In the end, Anami was right about one thing. The sacred land of Japan never perished. The nation survived, rebuilt, transformed into an economic powerhouse and democratic ally of the very country that had dropped atomic bombs on its cities. But the imperial Japan that Anami had devoted his life to defending? That did perish, completely, irrevocably. The atomic bomb didn't just destroy 2 cities. It destroyed an empire's delusions of grandeur. And when faced with that level of destruction, not just physical but philosophical, some men choose death over acceptance. Korechika Anami was one of those men. History hasn't decided yet whether that makes him a hero or a fool. Maybe he was both. Maybe the distinction doesn't matter. What matters is this. When the world changes fundamentally, the leaders who survive are the ones who can change with it. The ones who can't? They become footnotes in history, remembered not for their courage or their convictions, but for their inability to see what was right in front of them, even when it was as bright as the sun.